The 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill. Prince William Sound is an indentation on the southern coast of Alaska. Much of the land surrounding Prince William Sound is the Chugach National Forest, which is the second largest national forest in the United States. Rimmed with glacier-topped mountains, this 3,000-mile scape of bays, coves, and fjords, sea otters, birds, whales, and other magnificent sea creatures contains the greatest diversity of habitat formed along the eastern Pacific coast. This pristine wildlife area of our country was about to encounter a devastating interruption on the day that the Exxon Valdez oil tanker entered the waterways en route to delivering energy in the form of crude oil to California. This is an example of an unhealthy exchange with nature. The Exxon Valdez tanker is owned by Exxon, an oil company, in fact one of the largest oil companies in the world, that was started in 1870 by John D. Rockefeller and his associates. Originally called Standard Oil Company, Exxon is famous for being pioneers in the oil production and technology and has certainly changed the way that we use energy today. Sadly, Exxon is also famous for its irresponsibility in causing the second largest oil spill in our nation's history. It was March 24, 1989, at approximately 12:04 a.m. that the Exxon Valdez tanker had struck the reef. Here is a recording of Captain Joseph Hazelwood making a radio distress call.
Should be on your radar there. We've fetched up on the ground north of Goose Island off Bright Reef. And evidently we get some oil, and we're going to be here for a while.
Joseph Hazelwood, the captain of the Exxon Valdez ship, was mostly blamed for the spill. However, at the time of the spill, the third mate was steering the ship. The captain had passed the wheel over to the third mate because the captain had consumed 2 or 3 vodka shots, as sources say he was an alcoholic, between 4:30 and 6:30 p.m. At the time of the crash, the captain was asleep, although it is not determined if he was still intoxicated. The third mate was not qualified to drive the ship, and so Hazelwood was blamed for the spill. Captain Hazelwood was charged with 1,000 hours of community service and $50,000. Going to the initial spill, there were 3 methods of cleanup. The first method was called burning. Burning consisted of a boom with small holes poked periodically throughout it. The boom was placed on tow lines, and 2 ends of the boom were attached on 2 different ships. The 2 ships with the boom between them moved slowly throughout the main portion of oil until the boom was full of oil. The 2 ships would then tow the oil-filled boom away from the rest of the oil-covered water. At this point, the oil would be emptied from the boom and be ignited. This process was, however, discontinued due to weather difficulties. The second cleanup method was called mechanical cleanup. This method used booms and skimmers. However, the skimmers were not readily available during the first 24 hours following the spill. Not to mention, thick oil and heavy kelp tended to clog the equipment, and repairs to damaged skimmers and booms were time-consuming and sometimes extremely costly. Transferring oil from temporary storage vessels into more permanent containers was also difficult because of the oil's weight and thickness. The third type of cleanup effort was called chemical dispersants. Once burning and skimming became less effective, environmental technicians turned to chemical dispersants. Planes would be loaded with chemicals specially designed to disperse oil. The planes would then fly over the oil-coated sea and drop this chemical. This effort would speed up the natural breakdown of oil. When these chemicals came into contact with the water, they would allow the oil to chemically bond with the water. This process would prevent the slick from traveling across the water for endless miles. Not to mention, it would also speed up the breakdown of the oil. The only downside of this cleanup option was that the chemicals would sometimes create tar balls. In the process of the oil combining with water, this compound would form around sand and other components in the water, thus creating a large tar ball that is just consistently floating at the surface of the water. These balls could be scooped up by skimmers, but not all were scooped up. Most of them found their way back to shore or were ingested by sea life. The other downside is that the oil-treated dispersants have been found to be more harmful to coral reefs and seagrass than the crude oil itself. Plus, these chemicals are extremely dangerous to work with. One positive outcome from the catastrophe was that it forced the government to explore new cleanup techniques for when oil encounters water. When the crude oil from the disaster came into contact with the ocean water, it spread out into a paper-thin layer reaching extremely far. The oil contaminated everything it came into contact with. On shore, environmental technicians were using high-pressured, steaming hot water to clean the oil off of the oiled rocks. Later on, the environmental technicians switched from steaming hot water to cold water because they discovered that the scalding hot water was killing tons of shoreline organisms. There were no human deaths associated with the initial incident on March 24th. Yet, there were 4 human deaths during the cleanup process. Despite all of these cleanup efforts, 250 million sea life creatures died from the tragedy, not to mention the 460 miles of coastline that was destroyed as well. After all was said and done, it was reported to the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, that only 2% of the spill was actually cleaned up. Before the Exxon Valdez disaster, there were 8,700 other tankers that had passed through Prince William Sound and over Bligh Reef. However, on March 24, 1989, Exxon tried to take the same path but instead struck Bligh Reef and caused a huge catastrophe. At the time, the 1989 Exxon Valdez oil spill was the largest spill in all of recorded history. Even decades later, on May 5, 2010, oil was still seen seeping into a hole dug on a beach on Eleanor Island, Alaska. From the point when the Exxon Valdez tanker had struck the reef, it seemed like it took forever and a day to clean up the oil. A year later, the U.S. Congress created the Oil Pollution Act of 1990. The intent of this law was to minimize oil spills through improvement of tanker design, operational changes, and greater preparedness. As far as changes in ship design go, double hulls were added to prevent or minimize spillage when an accident occurred. Even though Congress passed laws to prevent oil spills from occurring in 1990, 20 years later the Deepwater Horizon disaster still took place in 2010. Therefore, until we curb our appetite for crude oil, we will continue to run the risk of further contamination from oil spills and the destruction of wildlife.